But there's no doubt we need more homes. The problem is Jackie Smith came out the other day, and she's the skills minister, believe it or not, and she said there aren't enough construction workers to actually build these houses in the first place. Let's talk to Peter Hitchins and find out what he makes of it all. Peter, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
I thought you were just the man to ask about the great leader's vision for Starmer-Grad, because you spent some time living in Russia. And you probably better than anyone to describe the architecture in some of those towns there.
I don't think we're going to be doing that. Even Keir Starmer isn't going to be doing that. A huge, great concrete slab stretching for miles, impossible to find your way around, because all they have to identify them is numbers, right, and then sub-numbers with lifts that don't work. Or in East Germany, favourite trick was to have lifts that didn't stop at all the floors.
Right.
So if you wanted to get to your home, you had to go to the floor above or the floor two up and walk down, which is an amazing piece of economic money saving, which I suppose we have to congratulate them on thinking of. But no, this isn't going to. This is going to be thousands and thousands of hideous, probably rather badly built box homes, almost certainly on floodplains and areas of the country where people have long known it was foolish to build, which will cause endless trouble in the future. And it's not true to say that we need more homes. It's true to say we need to accommodate the huge numbers of migrants who've been encouraged into the country by Labour and Conservative governments over the past 20 years. And they obviously have to have somewhere to live, and this was the consequence of it. I remember Andrew Green of Migration Watch. Whatever happened to them, you never hear them quoted. Have you noticed this? Migration Watch is a very authoritative body which used to know its stuff. But it's now vanished from the airwaves and been replaced by something called the Migration Observatory, which is a rather different outfit. I've often wondered how that happened. But leaving that aside, this is one of the many consequences of mass immigration, which we have to live with, and it will not be nice. These won't be towns; they'll be housing estates. Towns have curving high streets, ancient churches, long-standing residents, long traditions of how things are done, old grammar schools and stuff of that kind. These will just be masses and masses of featureless houses plonked down in whatever pattern the developers choose, without any character at all. And I feel for the people who are going to have to live in them. But there's nothing good about this, and I refuse to rejoice over it. But it won't be like the Soviets or the Eastern European housing plans, I don't think.
It'll just feel like it, though.
Even the Labour government wouldn't dare to do that here.
Well, I mean, I'm just looking at some of the rather strange sort of lessons that Sir Keir Starmer says he's appeared to have learned from going down to Cornwall with King Charles the other day to see what was going on in that local town, Nansleighan, I think it's pronounced. But he apparently said that he favours design principles for the new settlements. He likes the idea of Georgian townhouses and Edwardian mansion blocks as key inspirations. However, they've dropped a requirement for beauty, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, he can like them as much as he likes, but he won't get them because this kind of thing is expensive.
Yeah.
And also, to do it properly, it takes time.
Yeah.
And there's a great rush on. And as I say, I doubt whether many of these things are going to be very well built. And within 50 years or so, a lot of them have to come down again. Actually, the standard of building in this country is extraordinary. In Oxford, where I live, new buildings go up all the time. Yeah. And you can always guarantee that within 6 months, the scaffolding will be up around them again. It's become very noticeable.
And some of the things that used to look modern, I mean, I know this is going to sound like an old fogey talking, but I mean, I sort of shiver when I go past the Barbican every now and again, occasionally in a taxi around the back of St Paul's. It just looks awful, looks hideous, looks like the worst kind of red brick university that you'd have ever seen. I remember going to visit a friend there, or one of my parents' friends when it was first built, who lived there, and thinking, my God, this is amazing. But it looks really awful now.
Well, that was the last great frenzy of great big state building in the 1960s, when people said, okay, doesn't stop worrying about planning and what's in your backyard. Stop worrying about whether it's beautiful or not. This is what we need. Some people even believe, and they do believe this. You've got to give it to them. They believe that the Barbican and Trellick Tower and places that are beautiful. That's their problem, in my view. But what we are going to get now doesn't even have the sort of heroic ugliness of Trellick Tower or the Barbican. It's just banal and cheap and badly sited and destructive permanently, of course, of countryside which has existed untrammeled for years. And as I say, in many cases will be built on floodplains where we will be watching on television the people living in these houses having to be evacuated from them.
And as ever with any of these estates that are built, there's never really any thought given to how the drainage is going to work, or how emergency services are going to be accessed, or how doctors' surgeries are going to be built, or schools or anything.
There's thought given to it, but it turns out to be expensive, so it isn't done.
Right.
And this is the old problem with our water infrastructure. Enormous amounts of work needs to be done so that we stop dumping sewage in rivers and stuff like that. But it isn't done. So we build and build, and we don't supply the infrastructure for it, and then we complain that it doesn't work. It's typical of this country. Our delusions of grandeur prevent us from matching our resources to our needs. And instead, we try to do things we are not able to and not equipped to do, while we continue to have this supposed nuclear deterrent, which, when we try to test it, falls into the sea with a loud plop. And because we still imagine that we're a world power, and here's the point. I think you probably want to move on to it as well. The point that one will make, you hear the defense secretary say, well, if the Ukrainians have to decide how these peace talks pan out because they're the ones fighting. Well, it's not absolutely true.
Right.
They're the ones fighting because they couldn't fight if it weren't for the enormous amounts of ammunition, weapons that Western countries have poured into this war to keep it going for the past 3 years.
Well, this is right. And I mean, I was quoting from Ben Wallace earlier, who put a tweet out last night saying that, by far and away the most amount of money that's been spent on this war on the Ukraine side has come from Britain and the European Union, not from America. To which I said to myself, well, yeah, that's probably true. Maybe that's a good reason why it should stop.
Well, quite actually, in what way are we equipped or capable of doing that if we can't even manage our own sewage?
Right.
How have we got all this money to spend on destroying Ukrainian infrastructure or Russian infrastructure or whatever we use when we can't even build our own? There's delusions of grandeur in this. This has nothing to do with whether the war is right or wrong, though I think that it's an act of huge folly myself and the result of some really, really stupid diplomacy over the past 30 years. But leaving that aside, who do we think we are when we simply cannot run our? I would, describing my train journeys into and out of London yesterday, the pathetic nature of them, just the total inability of the railways to run the most simple and basic service of a train going to London from Oxford and a train going to Oxford from London. It's just, you can't. It's just impossible to sum up how feeble and useless it is. And yet here we are, as I say, posing as a world power and helping to keep a very, very dangerous war going. And my other fear about all this is that, reading what one reads this morning, Donald Trump originally said that he would finish the Ukraine war in 24 hours. He's obviously, for once in his life, taken some advice from someone and found out that that's not going to happen.
Right.
The difficulty he faces is that neither leader really has an interest in the sort of peace that he probably wants to impose. Volodymyr Zelensky, if he conceded territory, and actually said we're not going to seek the pre-2014 borders again, I don't think he would last for more than a month afterwards. He'd be removed from power by the strong nationalist forces and by his rivals, who made it so difficult for him to seek peace back in the sort of 2018 period.
And what do you make of? And what do you make?
So Putin can't give up his position either, because there are people behind him. In Moscow, people think Putin is terrible, but you wait till you see the sort of ultra-nationalists who would take over from him if he conceded Crimea, or indeed had anything which looked remotely like a defeat to the Russian people in Ukraine. That he's compared with them, he's a liberal Democrat.
Right, but on face value, it looks as though, I mean, I've just been watching Zelensky's reaction to what happened or what's been said, and they all seem to be willing to give it a go, it seems to me. I mean, I know that may sound slightly naive, but if they do get the process started, is there not a chance that that's better than them fighting at some point?
Well, it would be, and I'm not against that. I would dearly love there to be peace in Ukraine. I know these areas. I know the people there. I like them. I feel for them. I think that it's been terrible what's been happening to innocent people in that part of the world for so long, and I long for it to stop because of all the horror that it brings. But negotiation is very difficult once you have done, as we have done on our side, and as Putin has done on his side, once you have fanned the flames of anger about war and have made it a huge issue of principle and idealism, you can't then turn to people and say, well, actually, guys, it wasn't that important after all, let's have a shabby compromise. That's why it took so long to finish the First World War, because of the huge efforts made in the belligerent countries to tell people this was a vital war for freedom and civilization, on both sides, I should say. And then, of course, when they had to eventually have a compromise, it was incredibly politically difficult. And it went on for far longer than it need have done, precisely for that reason. Leaders didn't dare seek peace. So I would love it if it works. I hope it works, that some sort of peace can be obtained, because I'm sick of the sight of destruction and death and maiming and the waste of it, and of the general danger to Europe that it creates. But I wouldn't be too optimistic, because of we have raised the stakes in this very high indeed.
Yeah, and what if the EU and the UK are kind of sidelined in these conversations? Surely NATO won't be, will they?
Well, what is NATO? NATO is basically the United States plus a number of countries which hope that the Americans will defend them in time of trouble, and whether they will or not is another matter altogether. NATO is wholly dominated by the United States, and without it, it wouldn't really be a particularly interesting alliance. So I think that they are already sidelined. If the United States wants something in NATO, it will always get it. The EU... They allowed themselves to be pushed aside by the United States on this whole issue in 2008, the major EU countries, when George W. Bush, who, as you remember, was the diplomatic genius who created the Iraq War, and George W. Bush put forward the plan to offer Ukraine long-term NATO membership and Georgia, there was a lot of dislike of this plan among the major EU countries, but they didn't actually stand up to him. And I would say, as a result, what was already a pretty tricky situation in Central Europe was accelerated into a very dangerous one.
And not a coincidence, then, presumably, that Georgia and Ukraine later got invaded by Russia.
Well, actually, it's now you've said that, I have to say Georgia was not invaded by Russia. The Georgian government started the war with Russia, but there's the Tagliavini report commissioned by the European Union came to that conclusion. I'd know this is heresy to say it.
I just remember I'd never heard of South Ossetia before until then.
Well, I had. I'd been there, so there. But I've never been to North Ossetia, so I'm behind some people. But I have been to the.
Not many, I shouldn't think.
That's quite right, but it was an interesting visit. But I can tell you that as I say, the Tagliavini report, Heidi Tagliavini, a very distinguished Swiss diplomat, it looked into it, and it's quite clear that Georgia, under the leadership of Mikhail Saakashvili, started the hostilities on that occasion.
Right.
No, there is a basic problem that in the United States, a particular foreign policy faction has taken control of foreign policy on Russia, and did so really in the Clinton years. And it's a quite aggressive view, which involves an opinion that Russia should not be allowed to rise again as a power ever. And the other view, the more, in my mind, intelligent view, that Russia exists and therefore any European settlement must accommodate that fact, held by particularly George Kennan, the most brilliant American diplomat of the 20th century, has been pushed to one side. It may be that because Donald Trump, I think, is probably quite bored by events in Europe and much more interested by China, it may be that the Kennan view might begin to be heard again in Washington, not because Trump is particularly intelligent, but because it just doesn't suit him to pursue this war any longer. I mean, it is expensive for the United States, and it is a major entanglement. And we know from the past 50 years that the USA does tend to get bored with the interventions it makes. Ask any Vietnamese person.
Yeah, absolutely right.
That doesn't mean they don't do a lot of
behind the scenes stuff. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, listen, it's going to be fascinating. Peter, good to talk to you. We've got to run. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchins, columnist of the Mail on Sunday, there with his views on the Trump-Putin scenario as it's going on.